Hey everyone, it is week 15, and as you can see here, we are going to dive into the art and architecture of the High Middle Ages. We're not going to look necessarily at the Late Middle Ages, because there's information in the Late Middle Ages that's very important to talk about just before diving into a discussion of the Renaissance. And so that's stuff that I get into in English 202. So those of you who plan to stick around with Professor McIntosh and myself next semester in English 202, you'll get that information then. Right now I'm going to stick with the High Middle Ages. Now, something that I need to explain here is that, yes, it is week 15, which is our final week of classes. Next week is finals week. And so this is the last lecture that you will get in this class. I mean, you're getting materials from me and only me this week. But there is, however, a quiz. That quiz this week, and I'm sorry that it has to be this way, but it's the only way to make this semester and this online course really kind of work, is going to open for you on Thursday, December 1st at noon, as always, and close for you on the night of Sunday, December 4th at 11 p.m., as always. But now you'll see, right, that's the Sunday right before finals week. So, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room should you not get this quiz turned in on time for us to allow you to make it up. Because we've got to immediately jump into finals week. We need to get answer keys and things back to you guys so that you can study and be ready for the final exam. And so, yeah, so when this quiz does pop up, you want to make sure that you get it taken care of before the time expires, all right? Because we may or may not be able to accommodate you should you not get it in on time. Just keep that in mind, right? Second thing that I want to explain is that I'm recording this on Monday, the week of Thanksgiving, right? Just a couple of days before Thanksgiving. And this has been the only opportunity I've had to record. I tried to sit down and do it. If any of you were in DFAB on Monday of the week of Thanksgiving, anywhere from between 12 and like 1:30 thereabouts, you may have heard some extremely crazy noise. I don't know what was going on. Something was happening over here, I believe, in the bathrooms that are next to my office, where it just sounded like an absolute jackhammer was going. I think it might have been the pipes. We're having some weird water issues on campus today. And I couldn't record during that time. So during the time that I had set aside for myself to record this lecture, the sound over there was ridiculous. It was just, I couldn't hear when my mic was picking up the noise. I didn't want to do that to you guys. So the sound has stopped now, but I don't really have the time to sit here and record all of this right now. So what I'm going to do is, I hate doing this, especially as I had just really gotten back into a nice groove of only using new material, but I'm going to reach back and grab an old lecture that you'll see. So in a moment when I switch over to that, you're going to see like a wardrobe change. You'll see the setting that I'm in change because I'm recording this in my office here on campus, and that lecture I recorded in my studio back at home. And in addition to that, it's because it is an older recording, I've done my best. I've done my best to sort of edit it down and pick out any parts where I was talking about something that would have been only relevant to the very specific time at which I was recording, so that hopefully there's very little in there that's dated, but I could have always have missed something. So if you ever hear me speaking about something that really only refers to stuff going on in 2020 or 2021, depending on exactly when this lecture was recorded, I'm not 100% certain on that. Just know it's the result of that, right? That because this is an old recording. That's why, right? Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling now. Let's move into that. So again, we're going to dive into the art and architecture of the High Middle Ages. So we're going to focus now very specifically on the High Middle Ages. The art and architecture of the High Middle Ages. This is a period of time from about 1000 to 1300. So I want to talk about, since we are talking about the arts, let me move myself out of the way. The ways in which during the Middle Ages, disciplines of study were divided into the concepts of art and craft. So let's talk about art versus craft in the Middle Ages. Right? So during the Middle Ages, the system of dividing education into higher and lower castes of learning that we still have today was established in the Middle Ages. Right? This kind of thing still exists, right? Of sort of higher and lower castes of learning. There are certain things that if you want to study, right, you're going to go to college or university to learn those things. And certain other things, say if you want to learn to be a mechanic, well, you're not going to go to college or university for that. You'll go to some sort of a school specifically designed for that. Or you might learn the craft by working under someone else who is a mechanic. And notice that I use that word craft. That's because this idea of dividing up education into different castes is still with us today. And we still kind of label it in some of the same ways that we did. So there were, the caste system divides things into the disciplines, that is, into crafts. And crafts the disciplines that are considered crafts are the ones that are considered to be collaborative, and that these skills would be learned from others in the discipline. Liberal arts, and those the quotations around that term as well, were in the Middle Ages considered the refined human endeavors. Right? You may note that at Bethel University and in plenty of other universities, we still use that term, liberal arts. Right? It doesn't necessarily refer to art as in visual art. Right? The liberal arts were things that in the Middle Ages, and to this day as well, required a formal education at an academy or a university. These would have been things like science, literature. If one wanted to study theology, science would have been considered liberal art. The universities and the academies were predominantly male. There were very few universities that allowed women to attend. Universities and academies were, for the most part, for the vast majority of Europe, were male only. Women did not have access to that caste of education. Art in the Middle Ages was considered a craft. And I didn't mention this when I was talking about the upper and lower castes of learning, but crafts, because they were considered collaborative, and because they were something that one would learn from another person in the field, women could learn those things. And to a certain extent, a lot of things that are considered craft today are sort of in the sort of stereotypical, traditional realm of women, at least in Western culture, right? Sewing is considered a craft. Quilt making is considered a craft. Basket weaving, whatever, right? It's and granted, both men and women participate in all of those crafts, right? I'm just sort of saying that in Western culture, those have sort of had a traditional, long-held thought of being sort of women's work, right? And a lot of that dates back to the Middle Ages because those things were considered crafts and not something that you would go to university or academy to learn. So men and women could receive art training in the Middle Ages. This is not going to be the case when we get to the Renaissance. And so it's not until the Renaissance that suddenly the proportion of women who are allowed to participate in art seriously decreases. Because in the Middle Ages, both men and women received art training. They did so in monasteries and convents, and they would be working on illuminated manuscripts, they'd be working in embroidery, stained glass, all those kinds of things. And it was a collaborative effort, so men and women would often be working side by side on these things. I already mentioned this to a certain extent in the lectures last week, but both men and women scribes were working on these illuminated manuscripts that we see from the Middle Ages, but there were also men and women craftspeople. Sculptors could be both men and women. Masons could be both men and women. And even some of the artwork of the time was commissioned by and overseen by women for women. Most things were being produced by men for men. But when it came to art, there was a lot of art that was produced by women for women in the Middle Ages. And again, because that's going to go away to a great extent when we hit the Renaissance. So an example that we can look at is the Bayeux Tapestry, produced in Normandy, France, or at least that's where it is now. And it would have been produced circa 1086. If you've been watching the weekly wrap-ups for the past couple of weeks, that thing that you saw scrolling behind me in my virtual background in those meetings was the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, it is wrongly named. This is not a tapestry. This is an embroidered cloth. And it is significant in that it is 230 feet long. That's a humongous long piece of fabric. Both men and women would have learned to embroider. We don't have the names of the people who worked on this piece, but we feel fairly certain that both men and women worked on it. It depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England. You've already heard a little bit about that from Professor McIntosh last week. It depicts important people and events such as William, Duke of Normandy, Harold, Earl of Wessex, the Battle of Hastings, and it communicates these very patriarchal and chivalric themes. I'm sure you got a little taste of chivalry from Professor McIntosh's literature last week. Right? This is it's essentially a long, gigantic comic strip, really, that tells the story with little venues of it put on here as we go along, and also embroidered into it is in Latin are words that explain the stories that we're seeing. There are very few women depicted in the entire thing. Only 2 really are being depicted. But anyway, I found this little video right here online that is an animation of the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, of course, the actual, I'll let you know a secret, the actual embroidered fabric does not move. Somebody took it in and using computer animation, did some animating on it, and then also put some text over in modern day English so that we can understand what we're seeing, right? So this would have been made at the 20-year anniversary mark of the Norman conquest of England. And you saw just the heroic nature of it all, the blood, sweat, tears, battle, dismemberment of bodies, right? Heralding of chivalric fighting for one's king, right? All of that is contained within this big, long piece. Stained glass is another medieval art that really rises to prominence at this time. And again, this is an art that would have been considered craft, and we know that both men and women would have worked on these things. All right, so the insides of churches and what would eventually become cathedrals. As I mentioned to you before, the audience was meant to stand. There were not seats inside these churches. On top of that, by this point in time, in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of the population was illiterate and could not read for themselves what was contained in the Bible. Then, when one goes to church, the Mass is being performed by a priest up there who's reading and, for the most part, speaking in Latin. Now, he might deliver the homily in whatever the local language was. The parishioners who were standing in the church had to sort of trust that what the priest was telling them is what was actually in there, right? And so a couple of things were done. Stained glass windows served a couple of purposes. For one, they were meant to be these beautiful pieces of artwork that would make the interior space of a cathedral, church, what have you, as the light is streaming through all of these beautiful colors, to make that interior feel a bit more holy, a bit more like heaven. It feels otherworldly now because of all these colors and light streaming in. They were also there for to help those people who are standing to maybe stay awake, right? Because you're listening to all of this Latin being spoken that you don't understand a word of it. Your mind is going to wander. Your eyes are going to want to look around. You got something beautiful that your eyes can land on. But also, they helped as visual aids to tell those mostly illiterate people those mostly illiterate parishioners the stories that are in the Bible. They're hearing in Latin, right? There become these ways of using symbols in order to pass along the story to the illiterate, so that those who are in the church who look at the story can pick up on the little symbols and know which story is being told of them. In this particular case, it's the lineage of Jesse, and all the generations of Jesse that then lead us to Christ. Whenever we see a Jesse tree, this is how it's usually presented to us so that we understand that this is the story that's being told to us. Down here at the bottom, we usually have Jesse, in this case, lying on a couch, right? And then literally from his loins, a tree is sprouting up. Right? There's all sorts of innuendo there, and it's all intentional, believe me. And this tree that springs forth from Jesse's roots, or from Jesse's loins, rather, Jesse kind of is the root. We have generation after generation after generation, moving up until eventually we get to Christ here at the very top of the tree. Right? And that becomes a way of showcasing the sort of educating, if you will, the illiterate public who's in the church. And each of these individuals, you'll note, are wearing certain colors of clothing. They're holding certain items in their hand. Each of those things is to help identify that character as that particular character. And they would have been symbols that, though the audience was illiterate, they would have picked up on those symbols to let them know, oh, this is meant to be King David. This is meant to be whichever other individual. And we see that sort of getting repeated in this piece of stained glass. Right? We're getting a few different stories within it. Whether that be the birth of Christ down here, Jesus' baptism over here, the crucifixion of Christ in the middle. Right? But another theme that begins to happen as we get into the Middle Ages, or the High Middle Ages, is that we start to see the inclusion in art of those who paid for the art. Right? Oftentimes, right, so down here we have this man and we have this woman. A lot of times we'll see depictions of the people who were the patrons, who paid for the piece of artwork, in this case, the stained glass window, included and allowed to be present for these holy moments that happened in the Bible. And again, as I mentioned, there start to be certain rules, if you will, for not only how certain people are presented, but how certain stories are presented. So this is a window where the Annunciation is the story that's being told. The Annunciation is the biblical story of the angel Gabriel coming down to earth to announce to Mary that she's going to give birth to Christ. Well, certain things were established that must be in a depiction of the Annunciation. And these are going to get passed down through the rest of the Middle Ages and on into the Renaissance as well. So, first things first, you got to have Gabriel, you got to have Mary. In this case, I think this is most likely a patron over here who's been allowed to be present for this thing happening. All right, so you got to have Gabriel, you got to have Mary. Duh. Like, you kind of need those two in order to have the story. But that's not all, right? So, Gabriel is generally going to have wings. And Mary is often either depicted as reading a book or having just left her reading behind to pay attention to what the angel is saying. And as we can see, she's got a little stand right here with a book on it. Right? She was reading. And this was to be symbolic of Mary's religious piety, right? Right? That before Gabriel came down, she was busy like studying up and reading on the Word of God. That kind of a thing, right? Then, as I said, she'll either sometimes be just beginning to turn away from what she's reading, or she will have already put the reading down, and she'll be in some sort of position of submission. Like this one we see where she sort of crossed her arms and has bowed her head. She is accepting what it is that Gabriel has told her, that she is going to be the vessel that is going to carry the Christ child. Right? Now, not usually, almost always, there will also be a depiction of lilies somewhere in the image. Lilies. With the flower lilies. Sometimes Gabriel himself will be holding it. Sometimes Mary might be holding it. Sometimes it just might be in the room somewhere. In this case, we can see them right here. They're a little difficult to see, but they're right here. There's some lilies that are sitting here. Wherever they are, they're going to be between Gabriel and Mary. Right? If Gabriel's holding it, he could be holding it out. It'll be between him and Mary. In this case, it's just sort of sitting on a table, these lilies, but they're still between Gabriel and Mary. And again, the lily, the white lily, is a symbol for purity. And so they're included to be a symbol of Mary's purity, Mary's virginity, Mary's spiritual purity as well. All those things contained in that symbol. And lastly, you need some sort of representation of the Holy Spirit descending toward Mary. Sometimes it will be done as just a beam of light. Most often it is done as a dove. In this case, it seems like the makers of this stained glass window did both. There's a beam of light coming down from heaven, and there is a dove descending. The dove is a representation of the Holy Spirit. And these become like hard-held traditional rules that are passed down, and that if you're going to present for an audience in a church the story of the Annunciation, you must include these very specific symbols. Let's talk about convents and abbesses. Right? Abbesses would be nuns who are in charge at a convent, or what might be called an abbey. Right? So, after the fall of the Empire of Charlemagne, Germany becomes the first region of Europe to reestablish a stable government, and Otto I founds the Holy Roman Empire in 962. Many convents, and these are establishments that would be dedicated to the education of nuns and even laywomen, were founded under his rule. And these would have, each convent was under the tutelage of an abbess. Most of these abbesses answered directly to male officials in the government or the church, but for others, as I popped up here without meaning to, many of them, their power extended beyond just the convent, and many of them were placed in control of small provinces around the convent. These convents were responsible for much of the art that we see from the Middle Ages. They were responsible for illuminated manuscripts. They were the ones who scribed many of the books of the Bible for those who wanted to have them, a personal copy of it, or they might have just been used to educate further, later generations in the convent or abbey itself. They also are responsible for writing down a lot of the history of this time period. And they wrote a lot of encyclopedias. Again, these were usually edited material from lots of other sources that were sort of compiled together, either for education somewhere else, but most often it would be used for the education of the nuns in the convent in later generations. And again, there were both men and women scribes that worked on these books. So this, as an illustration of this, here is the first page of the gospel book of the abbess Hitta that shows the abbess offering this gospel. It's interesting. She's holding the book that we would be holding if we were looking at this page and offering it to the cloister's patron, St. Walburga. And her convent is pictured there in the background. The perspective is a little weird and wonky. Even what little development of perspective that the Romans had managed in their paintings was gone by this point. But still, that's a depiction of the convent that she would have been the head mistress of. She would have been the head nun, the abbess. She would have been the chief editor, if you will, of this particular gospel. I believe it was the Gospel of Matthew, but I'm not entirely 100% certain. She would have overseen both nuns and monks who would have been scribing in this book, writing down, copying, really copying the text of, let's say the Gospel of Matthew, though I can't remember for certain right at this moment. Copying those words in Latin, again, because that's what language the Bible would have been in, into the pages of this codex, and would have illustrated it with inks, with gold leaf, what have you. And then that would have been presented to whomever it was meant for, a wealthy individual, or to a king or queen or whatever, right? It would have gone on to someone. But it was dedicated, as you can see, to St. Walburga, and here she shows herself as presenting it to him directly. We don't get a lot of that kind of importance even from the men who participated in things like this. Like, she has no problem having herself presented right there on the page. The fact that we have Abbess Hitta depicted right there, and the fact that I'm pointing to it as such an interesting thing, is because a lot of art at this time, because it was considered a collaborative craft, we don't know the names of those who worked on it, for the most part. We know about Abbess Hitta, but how many other people did she have working under her to write this thing? And so most of the scribes who worked on these pieces are anonymous to us. Interestingly, though, we do know at least one person here. This is a page from a German Psalter, meaning it would be a book of Psalms. And we know the name of the scribe who wrote this particular page. It was a scribe by the name of Claricia. And this was produced somewhere around 1200. How do we know that? Well, this is the first page of whatever psalm, right, that is beginning here. This is the first page of that psalm. And clearly Claricia was given the task of writing and illustrating this first page. Now, the first page of any chapter, of any book of the Bible, or in this case, any psalm, would have the very first letter very large and very decorative. And it seems that the first letter of this particular psalm was a Q. We have this extremely decorative Q here. And but what's interesting about this Q is that the tail of the Q looks a little odd, doesn't it? The tail of the Q seems to be a delightful little self-portrait of Claricia that she even signed. She made herself into the tail of the Q. And that I find beautiful. Right? Claricia is a cloistered nun, laboring away, scribing at these pieces, again, for the glory of God, right? Living in the Middle Ages. She's supposed to be humble. She is supposed to put God and others before herself in every way. And yet, in a moment of, creative bliss, if you will, she decided to conclude this cute little self-portrait and even sign her name to it. That's something we just don't see very often at all. And again, is evidence that both men and women worked on illuminated manuscripts. Now, since I'm sticking to this theme of the sort of equal power of men and women in art, because art was considered a craft, Hildegard of Bingen, while we're still on this subject of abbesses, she is an interesting figure, born in 1098 and died in 1179, and we know her name, whereas, again, we don't know a lot of the names of the people who worked on these pieces at the time. But Hildegard of Bingen was a German writer, composer, philosopher, a Christian mystic. I'll talk about what that means when we get there. A Benedictine abbess, and a visionary. Again, we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And she wrote and supervised the scribes on a wide variety of texts. There are texts that we know she wrote, but then the scribes copied it down to make the actual book itself. And because she was an abbess, she also oversaw works that the scribes did that were not necessarily works that she herself had written. But amongst the works that are hers that we know of are Scivias, Know the Ways of the Lord. Scivias is just Latin for Know the Ways of the Lord. The Divine Works of a Simple Man, Meritorious Life. And these were books that she herself wrote, and then the scribes put down. As I said, she was also a composer. She wrote music as well. All right, Hildegard of Bingen. I am endlessly fascinated by this particular woman. Hildegard of Bingen, this is one illustration from the book Scivias that depicts how she claimed and things that she wrote down arrived to her, because she was a spiritual mystic. She believed that God very directly communicated by putting the information into her head. She said, and I quote, "It was a burning light coming from heaven that poured into my mind." And that's what you can sort of see happening here. This artist has sort of done their best, and I think they've done a rather good job of trying to illustrate how she described that as happening, because a burning light from heaven that pours into my mind. So this person seems to have drawn fire, but drawn fire that's kind of liquidy and is like pouring into her head, and look how her eyes are sort of like vacant. Anyway, so here she is. She's got in her lap a clay tablet into which she's going to write down the information that God has given her. And then out here, there's this priest, like he was like the one person she trusted to be with her in these moments. Although you see, he's not allowed into her cloister. He has to stay on the outside and sort of stick his head in. And he's looking down at the clay tablet with his scribing materials ready to go. His name was Volmar, Volmar. And Volmar is waiting out there to copy down whatever she writes. Right, and then he would have passed that on to the scribes. The scribes would have then copied it down. Fascinating woman. But let's say she also wrote music, and this is one piece of hers. I don't want to butcher the Latin, but that Latin there translates to the Holy Spirit. Again, she claimed that the music was given to her in that exact same way, that she wasn't the one writing this stuff. It was God sort of pouring his light into her mind, and then she'd write down this music. And so her music, you want to note, is a bit more complex than a lot of the chant, the Ambrosian chant and the Gregorian chant that we've talked about before. We'll go ahead and pause it there. As mentioned, it's being performed by Alexandra Marisa Wilk in 2009. Being sung by a woman who's dressed in traditional medieval attire, being sung by a woman because the work was written to be sung by women. A lot of what was written in the Middle Ages was written by men to be sung by choirs that were all men. The piece of music that you may have heard at the beginning of this lecture, the opening of this lecture, was a piece by a YouTuber who's calling herself Hildegard von Blingen, which amuses me, who's doing this whole thing where she's taking modern day songs and sort of converting them into medieval language and a type of music that would have been very similar to what Hildegard von Bingen would have done. Check her out if you get a chance. Hildegard von Bingen is the YouTuber's name. Now let's look at the architecture of the time. I'm going to dive into Romanesque and Gothic architecture. Romanesque architecture. The Romanesque church follows very quickly on the heels of the Carolinian church with its westward on it. So the Romanesque church you'll see is very similar in its design to the Basilica, particularly the Carolinian Basilica, right? With now a transept that has been much more widened, so the cruciform design of the church is now much more pronounced, and a few little additions. So some characteristic features of a Romanesque church. down here, I hope that registered. It's down there toward the bottom. There's a red underline under it now. The narthex. This is a new addition. It becomes part of the westwork. The narthex is an entryway where you step into the church, and it's kind of a vestibule area, if you will, a foyer kind of area where you step in, you're in the church, but you're not quite in the sanctuary. If you attend a Christian church, if you walk in the front doors of your church, you're most likely not stepping immediately into the place where you sit and worship, right? There's usually some sort of a greeting area, right? The narthex is that, right? There would have also been towers on either side of the narthex. That's what you see here and here. Those are showing the influence of the Carolinian design. There would have been the nave down the middle, right? That's not new. Those side aisles aren't new. Although the aisle sort of going around the transept, that's a Romanesque thing. There's also, we have the transept again, and we have the apse down there at the end, but there are also these apsidioles. It's apsidioles. I always struggle with that word. Right? They're these little small mini apses, if you will, that pop up around the outside of the apse, right? They're these little, small little, they're like little cloisters, right? In small chapels for like sort of individualized prayer. They might have been places to have confession. Sometimes there are burials in these little areas. And another Romanesque feature. So these are the new features, right? Most everything else is kind of, I mean, granted, like the things that are mentioned here, right? The side aisle bay, the compound piers, things like that, right? All that stuff. The main things that are going to distinguish a typical Romanesque church from the basilicas that came before it are going to be the narthex, the apsidioles, and the ambulatory, right? The ambulatory is, all right, here, right? In the apse, this is where the altar is. This is where the priest is going to preach. In a basilica, that would have been the end of the church itself. Now, suddenly, there's like a hallway that goes around and behind, and it's an extension of the aisles that come around, that line the nave, and then also line the transept. It now also goes back and around behind here. And that's to get to those apsidioles. But also, there might have been more artwork, more burial sites and things that would have been included back there as well. And an excellent Romanesque cathedral from this period would be the Speyer Cathedral in Speyer, Germany, where we can see at least some of the things that we were talking about from looking at it here outside. We see the westwork, right? But contained within that westwork would have been the narthex. We see the towers flanking that. We see the much more pronounced transept, creating that much more instantly readable cruciform design. And if we could see around back here, we would see that the apse is surrounded by small apsioles. Another one we can look at that will give us a good view of those apsidioles. I don't know why I'm struggling so much with it, guys. I apologize. Is the Moraruela Abbey that's in Spain that is sadly, as you can see, in ruins, that would have been built somewhere around 1170. And back here on the back end of it here, you can see that there's the apse. We can see another level right here, which would have been the ambulatory that would have brought us around. And then each of these little small cloisters, these little mini apses are apsioles. Right? Then the Gothic cathedral follows very quickly on the heels of the Romanesque. We get to the Gothic era, and we have architects that want a sense of, when you walk into these buildings, the majesty of them. And they want them to be taller and taller and taller. They want them to get to huge heights. But again, they've lost a lot of the information of how the Romans did that, right? The Romans were able to build these tall, multi-storied things. They want that as well. One of the things that's kind of been lost is the Roman arch and exactly how they made that work. And again, how they made tall structures stand up and not like fall over out of their own weight. So a couple of things get developed, a few things get developed that are markers that you can know if you're looking at a church, that you're looking at a Gothic cathedral. One is the pointed arch, right? This was what was developed as a means of sort of, we can't quite get this Roman rounded arch, but we can make a pointed arch to get that keystone on top of it, and we can make that work, right? Now, the pointed arch, I say again, the pointed arch, I say again, the pointed arch is extremely important. And I make such a big deal about this because the first semester I was teaching this humanities class, it blew my mind when we got to the essay portion, just how many people, again, this might be a little hint as to something that might be asked about in the exam, when talking about Gothic cathedrals, couldn't seem to remember that the pointed arch is like the most important, most prominent feature. Like I had students who were like, well, what was I missing? And I said, the pointed arch, the thing that I said was the biggest feature of it. And students were like, what are you talking about? The pointed arch. It was the first thing I mentioned. It was the thing that was super important, right? Like Gothic cathedrals, if nothing else, that pointed arch is the thing that you're going to notice about them. Don't forget it. That's an important, extremely, extremely important part of Gothic construction. Gothic architecture uses a pointed arch. Got it? Got it. All right. Then over here we have a architectural element known as the buttress. It is how the architects of Gothic cathedrals figured out how to get the cathedrals taller. They had lost the technology of concrete that the Romans had. So they didn't know how to get something taller and taller and taller and taller. If you try and make it too tall, it falls over. So finally, one of the things they figured out was that you could build a buttress. This would be a separate architectural element, right, that is separate from the main building, that will be against the building to act as a buttress. It acts as a little extra bit for the weight to be distributed onto, and it holds the building up as you build it taller and taller and taller. Then, as the advancements move on, there become these things that are known as flying buttresses. So the earliest buttresses, laugh all you want, have your fun with that word. The earliest buttresses are literally built right up against the building, right? Then it occurs to some architects that they can make something that looks much more elegant, perhaps much more stylistic, if they move the buttress away and then connect it with sort of a bridge, or what is referred to as the flying buttress. And then that, what that does is it takes the weight of the building, transfers it to the flying buttress into the waiting buttress, right? Which then transfers all that weight to the ground. So it becomes an extra thing. It's kind of like when you got something that's just wanting to fall over and you just kind of like lean a stick against it and keep it up. That's what the buttress and a flying buttress is. And then they added these things that are referred to as pinnacles. Pinnacles are just little decorative points that are placed in little portions of architectural importance, right? They're decorative. They're not meant to sort of really serve any structural purpose. Also, the Gothic era is really known for gargoyles, but we'll get to that. These that you're looking at right here are flying buttresses. All right, they're buttresses and flying buttresses. These are the things that are holding up the cathedral and helping it so it could stand taller and taller and taller. They wanted it to look like you had stepped inside of a building, but then when you looked up, the ceiling was just so high and so far away, it felt like it might be touching the sky. They wanted it to feel like you had stepped into a holy place, a place that would remind you of heaven, that would remind you that God is powerful and is way, way up there, right? That kind of thing. So it pains me to bring it up, but Notre Dame in Paris is probably the pinnacle, not really meant as a pun, but there it is, the pinnacle of Gothic architecture. It was built in Paris, France, from 1220 to 1250. And you may be aware, if you're not, allow me to educate you, that it caught fire, sadly, a couple of years ago and sustained a lot of damage. They're currently in the process of rebuilding it. It turns out that it's salvageable, so they're rebuilding it. But, it was a horrible thing to see on the news when this thing that caught fire was burning. But there it is. Look at that cathedral. Look at how tall and gigantic it's been built. Right? You can see it still has all of the earmarks of the cruciform design. Right? We've got our central corridor. We have our transept crossing it here. We have the westwork. That westwork is made up now of a narthex and a couple of bell towers. Down on this end, we would have an apse. We would have the ambulatory. We'd have some smaller apsiodes along there. But then the whole thing is made so much taller by the inclusion of these pointed arches, which allow for that more weight and more loftiness, but also these buttresses and these flying buttresses, which are beautifully graceful in the case of Notre Dame Cathedral. And there, God, just look at it, man. Like the height they got out of it. Look how tiny the people look in front of it. Right? And you see those pointed arches everywhere, right? Gothic architecture is going to have that pointed arch. You're going to see it everywhere, right? These two big towers on either side. And then look at the facade. The facade just meaning the face, the front of this thing, right? It is covered in tons and tons of sculpture, right? The sculpture we'll talk about in a moment, right? There's all the sculpture here. A lot of it's relief sculpture. Some of it is in the round. And all the sculpture as well as lots of gargoyles. And there are tons of gargoyles up here on these high areas up here. Go inside and you see what I mean by how this was meant to just inspire a sense of awe and a sense of you being tiny and small when you walk up inside this thing. Now, all these chairs have been set up here, of course, when this was a new cathedral. The parishioners would have been expected to stand. Down here at the end, you see the altar, right? Here are the aisles, right? We're in the nave. There would be a transept crossing right here. We're just not seeing it. We can sort of see where the openings are for it, but it would be going through there, right? And then all these huge, tall, pointed arches creating a vault, right? And a bare vault. Right, in the same way the Romans did, only instead of it being done in the Roman arch, they couldn't quite figure out how to do that yet. They hadn't figured that out yet. That was information that had been lost. What they had figured out was this pointed arch, and then with that pointed arch, they could make vaults and barrel vaults in the same way the Romans did. But they needed what are referred to as ribs. Right, that's these little architectural pieces here. This ribbing helped to provide a little extra support to it, also didn't come crashing down. Right, that pointed arch, don't forget. And then tons and tons and tons of gorgeous stained glass. This one in particular is particularly famous, the North Rose window in Notre Dame, we know the name Jehan de Celis, I believe, I could be wrong in that, that he worked on this piece. We know his name. He gets the credit for it. This gigantic rose window. And again, it would have been used to make the interior of the space just feel otherworldly, while also providing illustrations to help tell the stories to those who would be in those parishioners that would have been completely illiterate. Again, as I say, the outside of the cathedral covered with sculptures. There are the sculptures here on the left. This is what is known as the Gothic style of sculpture. It took a lot of influence from the Byzantine Empire and is adopting a lot of their ideology in their icons, but making it in sort of three-dimensional form. So the figures are elongated, and in a lot of cases like these here, they're also structural. They're also kind of acting as pillars to kind of hold things up. They're really elongated. Their fingers are elongated. Their portions are elongated. Oftentimes, their faces are kind of generic, like the Byzantine icons are. And they're not pushing for that same kind of realism that the Romans and the Greeks were interested in, right? They're very monumental is the term that often gets used. Both feet are planted on the ground. They don't feel very relaxed, right? They're very sturdy and monumental. And then there are the gargoyles. Let me move myself out of the way so that you can see the gargoyles. All right. The gargoyles here, right? These sort of grotesque, imaginary creatures are doing any number of things. In some cases, they're, again, structural. They're meant to be like rain spouts. Some of them are seen as perhaps a means of sort of warding away bad spirits when it's time for worship and things of that nature. But there are these gorgeous little grotesque figures that are a really fun, interesting addition because they're so imaginative. The artist sort of envisions like what would a creature meant to ward away bad spirits look like? What, right? Do I combine a goat and something with wings? Do I combine a bird and lion? And right? You see some imaginative reimagining of things. All right, that's what we're going to end this one, ladies and gents. Take care. Bye.